The sun was bright that afternoon, casting a warm glow over the rows of white chairs arranged in perfect lines. The smell of fresh flowers hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of perfume and cologne from the well-dressed guests. Soft music drifted from the string quartet, each note steady and calm, as if nothing in the world could disturb the beauty of this moment. At the front, the groom stood beneath a floral arch, his suit crisp, his hands clasped together to hide the tremor of nervous excitement. He had dreamed of this day for months, imagining the moment he would see her walking toward him, the moment they would finally be joined as husband and wife. He glanced at the crowd, catching the eyes of friends and family who smiled in encouragement. Every seat was filled. The aisle stretched before him like the path to his future. Somewhere in the crowd, his father sat near the front, tall and composed in his tailored suit. His silver hair caught the light, his expression unreadable, but calm. They had never been particularly close, but today, the groom felt a flicker of pride knowing his father was there to witness this milestone. The music shifted, signaling her arrival. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the guests. The bride stepped into view, her gown flowing like water with each step. Her veil caught the sunlight, and for a moment, it was as if time slowed just enough for everyone to take in the sight of her. She smiled faintly, not the wide, joyful smile most brides wore, but something softer, quieter. She began her walk down the aisle, her eyes lifting briefly to meet the groom's. He felt his breath catch, his chest tightening with emotion. But then something shifted. Halfway down, her steps slowed. She hesitated, her gaze breaking from his and moving, just for a moment, toward the man seated near the front. It was a glance that lasted seconds, but in that span the air seemed to change. A murmur rolled through the guests, small and uncertain at first. The groom's smile faltered, confusion knitting his brow as he watched her pause. Then, without a word, she turned. Her veil swayed with the movement, the soft rustle of fabric almost lost beneath the sudden gasp from the crowd. She didn't look back. She walked past the rows of guests, past the stunned faces and whispered questions, until she reached the man who had not moved from his seat. His eyes lifted to hers, and in that shared look, something unspoken passed between them. Slowly he rose. The groom's father reached out his hand, and the bride placed hers into it without hesitation. Together they walked away from the ceremony, away from the man waiting at the altar. The guests shifted in their seats, some standing, some looking to the groom as if expecting him to stop them. But he stood frozen, his hands falling to his sides, his mind struggling to catch up to the reality unraveling in front of him. The music faltered and then stopped entirely. The only sound left was the whispering ripple of voices moving through the crowd like a sudden wind. Someone in the back let out a shocked laugh, quickly stifled. Others shook their heads, unable to comprehend what they had just seen. The groom's mother, seated on the opposite side, pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes darting between her son and her ex-husband. Her expression carried the weight of someone who understood more than she was willing to admit. Outside the ceremony space, the bride and the father disappeared from view, the white gravel crunching under their steps as they made their way toward the waiting cars. No explanation, no announcement, just the quiet certainty of their decision, as if it had been made long before this moment. Back at the altar, the groom finally took a step forward, though his face remained pale, his eyes unfocused. Someone touched his arm, asking if he was all right, but he didn't answer. He could still see the empty space where she had stood, still feel the anticipation in his chest turning into something sharp and hollow. What had been meant as the happiest day of his life now felt like a wound in front of an entire audience. The guests began to stir, unsure if they should leave or wait for some explanation. The wedding planner whispered urgently to the officiant, who simply closed the book in his hands and stepped aside. The groom stayed there for a sight-long moment, the sunlight pressing down on him, the scent of roses and lilies suddenly too sweet, almost cloying. He looked out at the sea of familiar faces, all waiting for him to do something, say something. But no words came. Some betrayals are sharp and immediate, cutting clean through in an instant. Others are slow, their edges hidden until they finally pierce deep enough to leave you bleeding. This was both. And though no one knew it yet, the path that began in that moment would end somewhere far darker than anyone could imagine. The aisle, once meant to lead to a life together, had instead opened onto a road of secrets, anger, and choices that would destroy more than just a wedding. Before the day everything unraveled, they were three people connected by ties that seemed unshakable. The groom, Michael, was 30, steady in his work, loyal to a fault, and proud of the life he was building. He had met Claire 2 years earlier at a friend's birthday party, and from the first moment he spoke to her, he felt something certain, as if his future had stepped quietly into the room. Claire had a way of making whoever she spoke to feel like they were the only person there. Her laugh was easy, her eyes sharp with curiosity. She didn't shy away from his questions or hesitate when he asked her out. Their romance moved quickly, but not recklessly. They traveled together, spent weekends fixing up the little house Michael had bought, and began talking about marriage within the first year. Michael's friends liked her, his mother adored her, and even his father, always a little reserved, spoke well of her. David, Michael's father, carried himself with the confidence of a man who had learned long ago how to control a room without raising his voice. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with silver hair that made him look like the sort of man people instinctively respected. He and Michael had a complicated relationship, built on unspoken expectations and long silences, but they had managed to keep things civil over the years. Divorce had split the family when Michael was a teenager, and David's absences had left a mark. Still, Michael hoped the wedding would be a chance for them to stand side by side without tension. Claire met David early in the engagement. During a casual dinner Michael hosted to bring his family together. She was gracious, attentive, asking David about his work and his travels. Michael noticed the way his father's eyes softened when she laughed at one of his old stories. But at the time, it seemed harmless. She was simply being the woman Michael knew her to be, kind and interested. Over the months that followed, there were more family gatherings, birthdays, holiday dinners, and the long afternoons when wedding planning pulled everyone into the same room. Sometimes Michael would leave Claire and his father talking while he fetched drinks or took a call. He thought nothing of it, assuming they were building the kind of familiarity a future daughter-in-law and father-in-law should have. David seemed more present than he had in years, calling Michael to check in about the wedding, offering to help with expenses, even suggesting venues. Michael was grateful for the involvement, seeing it as a sign that maybe his father was trying to make up for the distance of the past. What he didn't see were the subtle moments that began to take shape between Claire and David when his back was turned. The way her eyes lingered on him a beat longer than necessary. The way David's hand would brush hers when passing her a dish. Small, almost invisible gestures, so slight they could be dismissed as nothing at all. Claire never said anything that could be taken as openly inappropriate. She smiled at Michael the same way she always had. She slipped her arm through his in public, kissed his cheek at the end of the night. But when she spoke to David, there was a light in her eyes that was different, softer, almost secretive. Michael had no reason to suspect. His trust in both of them was whole, untouched by doubt. To him, his father was trying to be part of his life again, and Claire was the person who made that easier. The idea that either of them could betray him never crossed his mind. David, on the other hand, was no stranger to temptation. His past was marked with quiet affairs during his marriage, things that never reached the surface but left cracks in the foundation. When he met Claire, there was something in her confidence, in her attention, that stirred the part of him that had always wanted more than he had. It was dangerous, but it was also intoxicating. Claire told herself it was harmless at first. She admired David, respected the way he spoke, the way he seemed to know exactly how to make her feel noticed. In him, she saw a version of maturity and power Michael didn't yet have. What began as admiration shifted slowly, imperceptibly, into something else. The wedding drew closer, and the three of them continued to orbit each other, bound together by plans, obligations, and the belief, at least on Michael's part, that they were moving toward the same goal. The truth was already there, forming in glances and brief touches, but it stayed hidden under the rhythm of daily life. If you had looked at them then, you would have seen nothing out of place. A groom preparing for his marriage, a bride who seemed devoted, and a father taking pride in his son's happiness. The surface was calm, almost perfect, and yet, just beneath it, a choice was being made. one that would take shape not in whispered confessions or stolen moments, but in the most public, irreversible way possible. Michael couldn't know that the two people he trusted most were already standing on a path that would lead them away from him entirely. He couldn't see the fracture forming or how quickly it would break open. That day at the altar would not be the start of his new life. It would be the end of the one he thought he knew. It began with something that could have been mistaken for coincidence. A shared ride after a family dinner when Michael had to stay behind for work. A conversation that lasted longer than it should have in the quiet of the driveway, both of them leaning against the car as if neither wanted to be the one to break away first. David told himself it was harmless to enjoy her company. She was young, vibrant, and seemed to genuinely value his opinions. Claire told herself she was only being polite, that she was simply getting to know the man who would soon be her father-in-law. But somewhere between those small excuses, a spark formed, one that neither of them tried very hard to put out. When Michael wasn't around, their conversations grew deeper. They spoke about life, about choices they regretted, about the things they wanted but never reached for. David found himself telling her stories he hadn't told anyone in years. Claire found herself watching him more closely, noticing the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, how his eyes seemed to read more than she was saying aloud. It didn't happen all at once. At first it was just longer looks, a hand resting lightly on her back as he passed by, a compliment that lingered in her mind long after he said it. But each moment, small on its own, began to pile up into something heavier. One evening she called him with a simple question about the wedding budget. They ended up talking for over an hour, drifting far from the topic that had started the call. When she hung up, her heart was beating faster than it should have been. She told herself it was nothing, but she already knew she would call again. David wasn't unaware of the risk. The line between them was thin and fragile, and stepping over it would change everything. Yet the idea of pulling back felt like giving up something he had only just begun to taste. For years, he had lived with a sense of detachment, moving through life without feeling much of anything. Now, here was someone who looked at him like he was more than his age, more than his mistakes. Claire tried to keep it in check, but temptation grew in the quiet spaces. When Michael left the room, when David's hand brushed hers, and neither of them moved away. The first time they kissed, it was quick, almost hesitant, as if they were both testing the weight of the choice. But the moment it happened, they knew they had crossed into something that could not be undone. After that, they were careful. They never met in obvious places, never spoke in ways that would give them away in public. A quick touch in a hallway, a message sent late at night, a meeting under the pretense of discussing wedding details. They told themselves they could control it, that they could keep it hidden until the wedding was over. But the closer that day came, the harder it became to pretend they were only playing with fire. They were already standing in the middle of it. Claire began to see Michael differently. He was kind, dependable, but compared to David, he seemed young in a way that made her restless. David was confident, certain of himself, and when he looked at her, she felt like the only person in the world. That feeling was dangerous, addictive, and she stopped wanting to let it go. David's thoughts became consumed by her. The sight of her walking into a room could shift his entire mood. He began to imagine a life with her, not as his son's wife, but as his own partner. The thought should have filled him with shame, but instead it gave him a strange kind of hope. In the weeks before the wedding, their encounters grew more intense. There were moments they almost told Michael, times when the weight of the lie felt unbearable, but fear kept them silent. The risk of losing everything, her security, his reputation, kept them moving forward as if the wedding would somehow resolve the tension instead of tearing it wide open. They didn't plan for it to happen the way it did. There was no grand scheme to leave him at the altar, but the idea was there, unspoken, growing between them with each passing day. Claire began to imagine walking away before the vows, to stop pretending and finally choose what she already felt in her heart. David didn't encourage it openly, but he didn't stop her either. Every time their eyes met, every time they stood too close, they were building toward a choice neither of them had the courage to name. By the time the wedding morning arrived, the truth between them was undeniable. Claire looked at Michael with a practiced smile, but her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. David greeted guests with polite warmth, but his mind stayed on her, on the possibility that the day might end differently than anyone expected. They had been walking a narrow edge for months, and with each step, the ground beneath them had grown thinner. What they didn't see was how quickly it could give them and how far they would fall when it did. The morning began with the kind of quiet that feels almost too calm, like the air itself was holding its breath. The sky was a soft blue, the kind that photographers love, with just enough sun to make the flowers along the path glow. Guests arrived in small groups, their laughter and conversation carrying across the courtyard. Every detail had been set perfectly. The white chairs in neat rows, the arch draped in roses, the aisle runner unrolling like a clean promise. Michael stood in a small room off to the side, straightening his tie for the third time. His best man clapped him on the back, joking about how nervous he looked. Michael smiled but said nothing. Inside, his thoughts were steady. This was the day. This was the moment he had been moving toward since the first time he saw Claire. He imagined her walking toward him, imagined the way she would look at him, imagined the life they would begin when they left this place as husband and wife. Claire was in another room across the courtyard. Bridesmaids bustled around her, adjusting her veil, touching up her makeup, whispering little compliments to calm her. She smiled at them, nodded when they asked if she was ready, but her heart was loud in her chest. She had barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw David's face, heard his voice telling her things she had never let herself believe from anyone else. She looked at herself in the mirror and wondered if she could go through with it, if she could stand before Michael knowing what she truly wanted. David moved among the guests outside, shaking hands, making polite conversation. On the surface, he was the proud father, present to watch his son step into a new chapter. Beneath that, his mind was on Claire. He hadn't spoken to her that morning, but he didn't need to. The weight of what they had been carrying was there in every step he took toward his seat in the front row. The music began, soft and steady. Guests turned in unison as the procession started. Bridesmaids walked down the aisle, their dresses swaying in the breeze. The flower girls scattered petals with shy concentration. Michael's smile grew with each step that brought Claire closer. When she appeared at the top of the aisle, the air shifted. Her dress moved like water, her veil catching the sunlight in a way that made her glow. Michael felt his chest tighten with emotion. He barely noticed the murmurs of admiration from the guests. All he could see was her. She took her first steps, slow and graceful. She looked at him, and for a moment, he believed everything was exactly as it should be. But then, halfway down the aisle, her gaze broke. Her eyes found David. It was brief, but in that briefness, something settled in her. Her steps slowed. The music kept playing, but the rhythm of the moment faltered. Michael's smile faded into confusion. Guests shifted in their seats, unsure of what they were seeing. Claire stopped, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. She looked back at Michael for only a second before turning fully toward David. The sound in the courtyard changed, a collective intake of breath, followed by scattered whispers. She walked toward him, the hem of her dress brushing over petals that had been meant to lead her to the altar. David didn't move at first, but when she reached him, he stood. He didn't touch her at once, didn't speak. Their eyes met, and whatever passed between them in that silence was enough. Michael's body went cold. He couldn't process the sight of her taking David's hand. The officiant glanced toward him as if waiting for direction, but Michael was frozen. The murmurs grew louder now, shock spreading through the rows like a current. David and Claire turned away from the aisle and began walking toward the side path that led out of the courtyard. The guests twisted in their seats to follow them with their eyes. Some called out in disbelief. Others sat stunned, mouths slightly open. Michael's mother stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable, her hands folded tightly in her lap. At the gate, David held it open for Claire, and they stepped through together. No explanation, no pause. Just the two of them moving into whatever came next, leaving behind the wreckage of the moment. Back at the altar, Michael finally moved. He took one step forward, then stopped, as if the distance between him and the place she had stood was suddenly too far to cross. The music had stopped now. The quiet was heavy, pressing down on him from all sides. The wedding planner hurried toward him, whispering something he didn't hear. His best man stood nearby, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground. Michael's throat felt dry, his chest hollow. The scene felt unreal, like he was watching it happen to someone else. But every face turned toward him told him it was real. The flowers still hung on the arch, the chairs were still filled, the sun was still shining. But the day was gone. The future he had been ready to step into had been cut away in front of everyone. And as the guests began to stir, gathering their things, speaking in low voices, Michael stood in the center of it all, feeling the kind of silence that can only come when everything you thought was certain has already slipped from your hands. By the next morning, the story was no longer just a private humiliation. It had left the courtyard in the stunned whispers of the guests and begun its slow, ruthless climb into the open. Someone had filmed the moment Claire turned from the aisle and walked to David. The video was shaky, but it caught enough. Her hesitation, the turn, the way she placed her hand in his without looking back. Within hours, it was on social media, passed from one phone to another like a secret too unbelievable to keep. The comments came quickly, each one adding its own twist to the truth. Some people laughed at the absurdity of it. Others were sharp with judgment, calling Claire every name they could type. There were voices defending her too, insisting she had followed her heart, even if the path was messy. But under all of it was the same stunned disbelief. No one could quite process that a bride had left her groom at the altar for his own father. Local news stations picked it up by the afternoon. They didn't have much beyond the video and a few quotes from guests who were willing to speak on record. One woman, a family friend, told the reporter she thought it was the most shocking thing she'd seen in her life. A man in the background muttered something about never trusting appearances. Michael didn't leave the house that day. His phone was full of messages, condolences, outrage, curiosity, but he answered none of them. Friends stopped by and sat with him in silence, unsure what to say that wouldn't sound small against the weight of what had happened. His mother called twice, her voice tight but careful, asking if he was eating, if he was sleeping. He told her yes, though neither was true. David and Claire were gone before the guests had even cleared the courtyard. No one knew where they had gone, only that they hadn't gone back to their separate homes. By evening, the speculation had already begun. Some claimed they had been planning it for months. Others said it had been a last-minute decision made in the aisle. The church community was split down the middle. Some saw it as a betrayal so deep it couldn't be forgiven. Others shook their heads and said love was unpredictable, that maybe it wasn't anyone's place to judge. But even those who said it with soft voices couldn't quite hide the gleam of gossip in their eyes. For Michael, the days that followed blurred together. He couldn't step outside without feeling the weight of strangers' stares. Even at the grocery store, people recognized him. Some gave sympathetic nods. Others simply looked too long before turning away. It wasn't just his heartbreak that was on display. It was his humiliation, replayed in every shared clip, every whispered conversation. David didn't call, not once. The silence from his father was almost worse than the act itself. Michael had thought, foolishly, that there would be some attempt at explanation, some kind of apology. But there was nothing. It was as if his father had stepped into a different life and closed the door behind him. Claire posted nothing online. Her accounts went quiet, her last photo still the smiling engagement announcement from months ago. Friends of friends claimed to have seen her in a cafe 2 towns over, sitting across from David, her hair pulled back, her face unreadable. Each sighting became a small flare of renewed interest in the story. Online threads dissected every detail, the way she had looked at him, the way he had stood to meet her, the way Michael had remained frozen in place. Every opinion was loud, certain, and rarely kind. What stung most for Michael was knowing there was no undoing it. No matter how much time passed, no matter what either of them did next, the story would follow him. It had been burned into the collective memory of the town and far beyond. He was no longer just a man who had been left. He was the man whose bride had chosen his father. Some nights, he sat in the dark and replayed it in his mind, wondering if there had been signs he had missed. He thought of every dinner, every family gathering, every time he had left them alone together. The memories felt different now, as if they had been rewritten without his permission. Meanwhile, David and Claire began to surface together more openly. They were seen at a small restaurant, then at a farmer's market, acting like any other couple. They didn't touch much in public, but the way they moved together left no doubt. Each new sighting was another cut, another headline, another reminder that the life Michael had planned was no longer his. In quiet corners of conversation, people speculated about how it would last. Some swore it was a fleeting thing, destined to burn out under the weight of how it began. Others thought it might hold, that maybe they were willing to live with the cost of their choice. For now, though, they were still together, and Michael was still alone. The scandal that had started with a walk down the aisle had grown into something larger, a shadow over all of them. And though the whispers had begun to fade in volume, the story was far from over. It was only shifting, changing shape, waiting for whatever would come next. They didn't hide anymore. At first, David and Claire kept to places where they wouldn't be recognized, but as weeks passed, they began to appear together in the open, as if daring people to say something to their faces. They rented a small house on the edge of another town, far enough from Michael's neighborhood to avoid casual run-ins, but close enough that news of their sightings still made its way back to him. The house itself was unremarkable. White paint, small porch, narrow driveway. But for them, it was a kind of refuge. Inside, the walls were bare at first, the air smelling faintly of fresh paint and something new. They brought in furniture slowly, a mix of pieces David had kept from his old place and new items Claire picked out. She favored soft colors, blankets thrown across the back of the couch, and candles that made the rooms feel warmer than they actually were. From the outside, it looked like any other couple starting a life together. They bought groceries, paid bills, and settled into a rhythm. David would make coffee in the mornings while Claire sat at the table scrolling through her phone. They cooked dinner together most nights, moving around each other in the small kitchen as if they had been doing it for years. But beneath the routine, there was a tension neither wanted to name. They had taken something that was never meant to be theirs, and the shadow of that choice followed them into every quiet moment. Sometimes it was just a glance, one of them catching the other lost in thought. Sometimes it was a silence that stretched too long over dinner. The world outside their little house had not forgotten. Strangers stared when they went out, some with open curiosity, others with open disgust. Once, in a grocery store aisle, a woman brushed past Claire and muttered something sharp enough to sting. David bristled, but Claire only kept walking, her face calm, as if she had learned quickly that reaction would only feed the fire. They didn't speak much about Michael. When they did, it was brief, careful. Claire told herself she didn't need to justify what had happened. She had made her choice, and she wasn't going back. David told himself the same thing, though in the dark, when the house was quiet, he sometimes thought about the look on his son's face that day. Money was tighter than either of them had expected. David's work was steady, but carried less weight now that his personal life had become a subject of gossip. Some clients kept their distance. Claire had left her job before the wedding and hadn't yet found another. She spent long hours at home, cleaning, rearranging, or sitting in the backyard with a book she never seemed to finish. They tried to create small joys. Weekend drives to the coast, new recipes, evenings spent watching old movies. There were moments when they laughed easily, when it almost felt like the world outside didn't matter. But the cracks were there, waiting. The first argument came over something small, a misplaced bill, a forgotten errand. But it flared quickly. Words were sharper than either intended, and when it was over, they sat in opposite corners of the couch, not looking at each other. It passed, but left a faint bruise on the air between them. Other arguments followed, each one revealing a little more of the strain beneath the surface. Claire accused David of being distracted, of holding something back. David told her she was restless, too quick to take offense. They always made up, but the space between apologies grew longer. The people who had once been part of their lives had mostly fallen away. Friends chose sides, and most chose not to be part of theirs. Family gatherings no longer included them. The isolation was both a comfort and a weight. Claire sometimes stood at the window in the evenings, watching the lights in the houses across the street. She wondered if those homes were filled with the kind of stability she had left behind. David watched her from the kitchen, wondering if she regretted any of it. Neither asked the other directly. They had traded one kind of life for another, believing the choice would lead them to something better. But the new life came with its own kind of silence, its own kind of loneliness. And though they didn't speak it aloud, both knew that the ground beneath them was still unsteady. They had built this relationship in the heat of defiance, but now it had cooled into something that required more than just wanting each other. It required trust, patience, and the ability to weather the storms that came without warning. And somewhere in the distance, though they couldn't see it yet, another storm was already on its way. The small arguments began to shift into something heavier. They were no longer just about forgotten chores or mismatched schedules. They cut deeper, pulling at the foundation of what they had built. David noticed how Claire's tone changed when she spoke to him, less patient, quicker to push back. Claire noticed how David's silences grew longer, how he seemed to drift elsewhere even when they were in the same room. It wasn't just them. The outside world kept pressing in, and the pressure never really left. Each time they went out together, they felt the eyes on them. Sometimes it was a sideways glance, sometimes an openly hostile look. Once, a man in a parking lot muttered a comment just loud enough for them to hear. David told him to watch his mouth, but Claire tugged at his arm, pulling him toward the car before it could turn into something worse. At home, the quiet was no safer. Claire's job search dragged on, each rejection a small sting that added to her restlessness. She tried to fill her days with projects, cooking or tidying up, but the rooms felt smaller each week. David came home tired, his work weighed down by whispers and strained relationships. Even his oldest contacts seemed more cautious now, and though he didn't admit it, the dip in income gnawed at him. One night after a long day, David found Claire sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. The screen lit up her face, but her expression was unreadable. He asked what she was looking at, and she said nothing important. But when he walked past, he caught a glimpse, a social media post from one of Michael's friends. She closed it quickly, but the image stuck in his mind. He didn't mention it right away. Instead, he let it sit, and over the next week, it festered. The thought of her watching their lives from a distance made something sharp twist inside him. When he finally brought it up, it came out harsher than he meant. She snapped back, saying she had every right to look, that it didn't mean anything. The fight that followed was loud and ugly, the kind that leaves the house feeling different when it's over. They made up eventually, but the trust between them had shifted. David began to notice small things, her stepping outside to take a call, her phone angled away from him on the couch. Claire began to notice his late nights at the office, the way he avoided talking about where he had been. Neither had proof of anything, but suspicion doesn't always need evidence to grow. By then, the whispers around town had started to change. At first, people spoke about them with shock or curiosity. Now the tone had shifted to something colder, almost gleeful, as if waiting for the inevitable collapse. Friends of friends hinted that Michael had been seen near their neighborhood. Others said it wasn't true, that it was just another rumor. But once a seed like that is planted, it's hard to ignore. Claire noticed a car parked across the street one night. The engine was off, the windows dark, and after a few minutes it drove away. She told David, but he brushed it off, saying she was imagining things. Still, she found herself checking the blinds more often, scanning the street before locking the door at night. The tension began to show in ways they couldn't hide. Neighbors noticed the raised voices through the open windows. Once, Claire slammed the front door so hard the glass rattled, and the woman next door paused on her porch, pretending to check her phone while listening. They tried to patch things up, booking a weekend trip to a cabin outside the city. For a short time, it worked. They cooked together, sat by the fire, even laughed like they used to. But on the drive home, they fell back into silence, and it stayed with them all the way to their doorstep. What neither of them admitted was that the life they had now was nothing like what they had imagined when they chose each other. They had traded passion for routine, stolen moments for constant exposure. The secrecy that once fueled them had been replaced by scrutiny, and without the thrill of the hidden, they were left with the hard truth of who they were together. Every choice has a cost, and theirs was starting to come due. The small house that had once felt like a refuge now felt like a cage. The roads they had taken to avoid judgment now seemed to circle back on themselves. They had stepped into this life believing they could outrun the fallout, but the storm that had been gathering since the wedding day was finally beginning to break, and neither of them could see just how violent it would become. It was a Monday morning when the neighbors first noticed something was wrong. The blinds in David and Claire's living room had been closed for days, the kind of heavy shut that keeps out more than just sunlight. The small porch light, usually off during the day, was still glowing faintly against the gray sky. At first, no one thought much of it. People kept to themselves on that street. But by the third day, the mail was still stuffed into their box, and the car in the driveway hadn't moved. A neighbor across the street mentioned hearing an argument late one night earlier that week. It had been loud enough to catch her attention, voices sharp and fast, but it ended suddenly, as if someone had slammed a door. After that, she didn't hear anything at all. Not laughter, not movement, nothing. The police arrived just after noon. Someone had finally called in a welfare check, worried that they hadn't been seen. The officers knocked several times before trying the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was heavy, stale in a way that spoke of hours, maybe days, without movement. The living room looked untouched, a half-finished mug of coffee on the table, a blanket tossed over the back of the couch. They found Claire first. She was in the bedroom, lying still on the bed, her hair spread out across the pillow as if she had simply fallen asleep. But the stillness was wrong. Her skin was pale, her lips faintly blue. There were no signs of a struggle in the room, no overturned furniture or broken glass. On the nightstand, a glass of water sat untouched. David was in the hallway, not far from the bedroom door. He was on the floor, one arm bent under him, his face turned toward the wall. There was a faint trace of something dark on the carpet beneath him, barely visible against the shadows. His eyes were open, but empty. The scene was quiet, too quiet for the kind of story that had surrounded them in life. There were no signs of forced entry, no splintered locks, no broken windows. Whatever had happened between the two of them, inside the walls they had shared. Detectives moved slowly through the rooms, marking what little there was to mark. The kitchen counters were clean except for a single plate in the sink. The bathroom light was still on. A phone sat on the coffee table, its screen dark, the battery long dead. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, watching the movement of uniforms through the open door. Whispers passed quickly, each one reshaping the truth before it even had a chance to settle. Some said it was a murder-suicide. Others insisted it had to be someone else. That maybe the parked car Claire had seen before wasn't just her imagination. In the following hours, the coroner's van pulled up, and the street fell into a deeper silence. White sheets and careful hands carried them away, one after the other. The flashing lights reflected in the windows, painting the houses in brief bursts of red and blue. The news broke before sunset. Headlines were careful but clear. Couple found dead in home. The history between them made the story impossible to keep quiet. Photos of the wedding day betrayal resurfaced alongside their names, each image reminding people exactly who they were and how they had come together. Police gave few details. They confirmed there was no sign of an intruder and that the deaths were under investigation. That phrase only fueled the speculation. Online, people argued over what might have happened. Some were quick to believe it was an act of violence born from months of strain. Others clung to the idea of an outsider, a shadow from their past, finally stepping into the light. For Michael, the news came as a blunt, cold message from a friend. He read it twice, unable to process the words. The people who had destroyed his wedding, who had walked away together without looking back, were now gone. There was no warning, no chance for confrontation, no answers, just an ending. That night, the house sat dark and empty, the porch light finally off. Inside, the air still held the weight of what had happened, though no one would walk through those rooms again without feeling it. Whatever had unfolded in those final hours would be pieced together in reports and evidence logs. But the truth, why it ended this way, was something only they had known. The street returned to its usual quiet in the days that followed, but the memory lingered. Neighbors still slowed their steps when passing the house, glancing at the drawn blinds. And in the minds of those who had watched their story from the beginning, the ending only deepened the questions, leaving the whole thing suspended between tragedy and inevitability. The funerals were held on separate days. David's service was small, almost formal, attended mostly by a handful of colleagues. His name carried a weight now, not from his career or achievements, but from the shadow of what had happened.